This is a podcast from the British Library. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.
As you know, this conference has been very much about collections-based research in the study of Buddhism, and as I'm sure all of the very fine scholars who have been presenting their research would agree, the key to successful collections-based research is the existence of any collections in the first place. To that end, and in fact, even more importantly than that, when we think about these collections, this is the cultural heritage of Buddhist communities, past and present, throughout Asia and beyond. So, on that very matter, the final panel of the conference is on the subject of preservation, conservation, and dissemination, making these accessible to the wider world. So, I'd like to introduce the first of our speakers for this, Dr. Jann Ronis. He's joined us here from the US, where he is the Executive Director of the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. He's also held teaching and research posts at CNRS in Paris, the Tibetan and Himalayan Library, the University of Virginia, and the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include the social histories of visionary cults, scholastic traditions, monastic reform movements, and sectarian conflicts, the philosophical and contemplative traditions of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, and Sino-Tibetan cultural relations. So if I can please ask Jann to join us on the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I would like to thank all of my old and new friends here at the British Library for inviting me, including Louisa, Sam, Charles, Matt, Jody, and others. So unlike the other speakers, I am not giving a talk based on my own research or fieldwork, unfortunately. But I think the organization I represent is quite interesting, and so I hope the story of our history and some of our current projects is going to make something of a contribution to the conference overall. I will be speaking about collections, but at the very beginning of the conference, Louisa also mentioned collaboration as a kind of a sub-theme of the conference, and so hopefully I'll also be able to address that concern. All right, the title of the talk, as you see here, Indra's Net for the Information Age. So what is an Indra's Net? It's a popular metaphor for the mutual interpenetration of all phenomena. And it appears in a very prominent Buddhist sutra and is often represented in art, sculpture, paintings, and so forth. So Indra's net represents a very high and lofty philosophical principle within Buddhism. Applying it to my organization, breaks down very quickly, but I just wanted to say that Indra's net is something of a pertinent theme to what we're trying to do here, because we are connecting Buddhist literature with the world. And so how do we do that? BDRC is involved around Buddhist Asia in preservation projects. So that's a major part of our work. But not only do we preserve, we also try to make Buddhist literature accessible and to draw connections between elements of Buddhist literature and with the wider world. So in October, we had a board meeting in which we thought about the identity of the organization, our 5-year plan, and we even revisited our mission statement. And we came up with a new slogan for ourselves: connecting Buddhist literature with the world. And we think of it as having two elements. The first is just connecting Buddhist literature, finding or rather, are digitally articulating the deep connections that already exist within the broader universal Buddhist corpus. Scholars, in their very organic and analog ways, are able to discuss and write about all of the historical and philological and philosophical connections between Buddhist literature. But finding a way to code that in software is quite another matter. And so that's something we're trying to do at BDRC, connect Buddhist literature and then also with the world. Not only making it accessible to specialists, but also over the next few years, trying to find ways to create content that serves a non-specialist, interested and educated audience. Okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our founder, Jann Smith. He is quite a legend in Tibetan studies, at least. So you see here his dates. So Jann Smith was born in Utah, and you'll see from his last name that he is a descendant of, reputedly, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon religion. So he sort of comes from a powerful empire-building dynasty, and he inherited that mantle very well. So he ended up in Seattle at the University of Washington in the late 50s, where he majored in Asian studies, specializing in Mongolian and Sanskrit. And he was lucky enough to be there in residence in 1959 when the Sakya family, a very important religious and dynastic family from Old Tibet, moved to Seattle. And some of the family members took up posts at the University of Washington to teach Tibetan language and Buddhism. So he stayed on as a graduate student in Seattle and spent time with the lamas and the leaders of the family on almost a daily basis for 4 or 5 years. And so while there in Seattle in the early 60s, when there wasn't a lot of secondary material for the study of Tibetan Buddhism, he was able to learn directly at the feet of these incredible inheritors of the tradition who themselves had been trained in very traditional ways. And so he had a unique upbringing in his studies that really was pretty much unmatched, I think, by other Western scholars of his generation. His main sort of informant or master, you could say, was the Venerable Daishung Rinpoche, who is the subject of a very interesting book by David Jackson called A Saint in Seattle. So if you'd like to learn more about this time period, that book is really interesting. In 1962, after mastering Tibetan and learning so much about the traditions and history in a very quick way, he went on a tour of European libraries because he understood that the libraries in Europe had much vaster collections of Tibetan material than we had in the States. Of course, he came to the British Museum and spent some time with Hugh Richardson. At BDRC, we still have a lot of Jann's correspondence, and so I'm showing you just one example of his correspondence with Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, who are probably well known to many of you. And then in 1964, he moved to Leiden, where he began working on his dissertation in Sanskrit and Pali. Then in 1965, Jann went to India and ostensibly to collect some books and to consult further with lamas. As many of you know, there was a massive refugee population that began moving into India and Nepal in the late 50s and early 60s. Tibetan refugees. Jann went to study with them. And the way I understand the turn that his life took once he moved to India in 1965 is that Jann went to India, like so many doctoral students, expecting to, gain a lot from his interactions with representatives of the tradition, but then go home, work on his dissertation, and then enjoy a very cushy life as a professor. And he would have ended up at a very prestigious institution, no doubt. But the way I understand it is that once he arrived in India and he saw the condition that the Buddhist tradition was in at that time, he decided that it would be, incredibly selfish of him if he just went, gathered together a lot of important texts, and then left, his Tibetan friends behind and just studied in a way that only benefited himself. So he gave up on his PhD studies and, in fact, never completed his doctoral degree, and instead spent the next 30 plus years in India. So he moved there in 1965, lived with the Minister of Education, Ram Kirpal, for several years, and then in 1968 began working for the Library of Congress at their field office in Delhi. And he worked at the Library of Congress until, I think it was 1997, so for 30 years. And he worked his way up the hierarchy there and ended up being the field officer. But at any rate, Jann is considered by Tibetans to be a bodhisattva. We can understand that in very metaphorical terms, but they came to that conclusion because he had both incredible prajna, or wisdom, and also upaya, compassion, an ability to use skillful means to have an impact on the world, especially in a dharmic way. So if I can explain to you briefly how he used his great compassion to benefit the Tibetan textual tradition, the story goes as follows. The Library of Congress field office in New Delhi was chiefly involved in collecting pretty much all significant books that were being published in India at that time, in any language. Of course, Hindi, Punjabi, Sanskrit, all the South Indian languages as well. And the Library of Congress was buying 23 copies of each of these books, cataloging them and then sending them to repository libraries around the states, and then I think even further afield. At any rate, the Tibetan language at that time was already considered a South Asian language, so it qualified for this program. However, there were not very many Tibetan books for sale at the bookstores. There were a lot of ancient manuscripts that had just recently arrived in India, but there weren't multiple copies of those, and they didn't qualify as modern publications. So Jann figured out a way to create a whole new economy that would conserve the texts, duplicate the texts, and then get them published, or rather purchased and disseminated around the world. And so this took place through this program called the PL 480, Public Law 480. And so Jann, after gaining the trust of some lamas who had important collections, went to some different printers and publishing houses there in New Delhi, and he asked them if they had the photomechanical means to reproduce ancient documents, and they did. So they tried out different ways, and they figured out how it could be done relatively efficiently. And then he went back to the Library of Congress just to confirm that if he was to help the publishing of dozens or hundreds of volumes of books, that they would buy them, and they agreed. So then he worked out a deal with the publishers that if he was to guarantee that 25 volumes of every run would be purchased at a high price, that the remaining 75 volumes would be sold at cost to Tibetans, to lamas, to monasteries, and then also some peripatetic Western scholars who were showing up in New Delhi at that time, in the late 60s and early 70s. The Printers were happy to try this out, and it ended up being a smashing success that led to the publication of hundreds, if not over 1,000 volumes. Oh, I think easily over 1,000 volumes. All the classics that were brought over across the Himalayas on the backs of Tibetan refugees, almost all of them were reproduced. So therefore preserved and then made much more widely available to the Tibetan monasteries and libraries, which were reestablishing themselves at the time, and then also to the broader global Tibetan studies community, not just in North America, but certainly in Europe, and also places like Japan. So this was Jann Smith's great gift to the Tibetan community and to Buddhism overall, and to us Tibetan studies people. Jann, I think I jumped ahead. I didn't want to go to that slide just yet, but Jann retired from the Library of Congress, as I mentioned, in '97, and then moved back to the United States. He hadn't been living in the States for the longest time. He didn't have a driver's license or anything like that, but he certainly wanted to continue his work of preservation, knowledge creation, and just the general accessibility of Buddhist texts. So once he returned, he became aware of some emerging technologies that certainly were not available to him when he was in India in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Technologies such as consumer or prosumer grade scanning equipment. And then there's the internet itself. So he thought, maybe now that I'm back home in the States and I have my massive library with me, perhaps I can try to institute a PL 480 2.0, if you will. An entirely new wave of preservation, reproduction, and dissemination. This time using digital means, not photomechanical reproduction. And so he, certainly knew a lot of people at that time, important people, donors, enthusiasts, and scholars. And so they joined forces and pocketbooks and did a pilot program to digitize a few texts to see how it would work, how long it might take to do each volume, whether there was even any interest on the part of scholars in something like this. And it was immediately embraced by the community. I started graduate school in 1998 at University of Virginia, and I distinctly remember, I think it was my second semester of graduate school, so it would have been the spring of 1999. I was in the seminar classroom waiting for my professor to arrive, and he showed up, and he brought with him an envelope that he had just received from Jann Smith containing a CD in a jewel box, and it was basically the pilot CD for what became TBRC and then later BDRC. And he said, wow, there's this incredible scholar, Jann Smith. He's now back in the States. He hasn't been here for very long. He has an amazing library, and apparently he's now digitizing texts. At that time, my Tibetan was very rudimentary. I didn't know anything, but the idea that texts could be just delivered to you on a CD seemed just like a godsend. And so the CD was circulated around the seminar table. Everyone got a chance to load it onto their computer. I did. I then burned a copy, which I still have 20-some years later. But at any rate, TBRC started in a very humble way, just as a CD distribution mechanism, and then eventually turned into a website that is now very highly trafficked by Tibetanists and then Buddhist Studies scholars who know Tibetan. Jann's entire library, containing over 11,000 volumes, was fully digitized in about 15 years. And now the organization has moved on to embrace other types of Buddhist literature, which I'll tell you about shortly. So Jann sadly passed away in 1999, but fortunately the organization has continued to thrive last year, 2019, was our 20th anniversary. Oh, I see. Founded in 1999. For some reason, I read that as his death date. My apologies. Founded in 1999. And so Jann passed away in 2010, as I said, December. His obituary was printed in The Economist even. It was a very sad event for people in South Asian diplomacy, but especially in Tibetan studies. In 2015, the organization changed its name and changed its mission from the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center to the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. Now, why was that? By 2015, we had fulfilled our original mandate, which was to scan, catalog, and make accessible Jann Smith's personal library, as well as a few other small collections in South Asia that we had good relations with. And so, fortunately, our donors, such as the Kensei Foundation, came to us and said, look, as philanthropists, we always need to monitor our grantees and to let them know when they fulfilled their mission and need to move on or maybe go into a sort of a hibernation mode. So that was a very scary prospect for us because we didn't have access to any other major Tibetan collections at that time, but we certainly had the drive to continue. And by that time, we had such a skilled staff skilled in digitization, but also in informatics, creating a good database and a user-friendly website. So with an initial seed grant from the Ho Foundation, who, as you all know, is one of the main sponsors of this weekend's event, we called together an assembly of scholars representing all the different major Buddhist literary traditions, and we asked them whether it might be possible to take the TBRC model and scale up to embrace other Buddhist traditions, especially Sanskrit, Southeast Asian, and Chinese literary traditions. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for that. So then we received a larger grant from the Ho Foundation to build an entirely new platform, web platform, one that could be multilingual, and also to begin digitization of non-Tibetan materials. So we have been working outside of the Tibetan area for several years now, and I'd like to tell you about some of these projects, because not all of them have gone online as of yet, but you'll get a sneak preview here today. Before I begin talking about our non-Tibetan projects, I just want to reassure the Tibetanists in the room that we, in no way, shape, or form, have abandoned Tibetan studies. Indeed, I think that we're more productive now in the Tibetan field than ever before, because we, in the past couple of years, independent of our scaling up, have finally been able to operate in China itself. And so on a sort of daily, if not weekly basis, we are scanning volume after volume of ancient, very old manuscripts and xylograph prints that up until now had not been digitized, and some of which are not very well known. So if you do Tibetan studies, please go back onto the website, search for text by some of the more obscure authors. We've been uncovering a lot of rarities that were thought to have been lost or had just never been heard of before. Additionally, we also have a big scanning project at the National Library of Mongolia to digitize all of their Tibetan collection, which is comprised of approximately 40,000 volumes. So that will double our Tibetan collection, just that one project alone. Okay, digitization of endangered archives. So lately we've been working in Nepal, China, Mongolia, Thailand, and Cambodia. So BDRC, aspires to continue to be the leader of text digitization in Buddhist Asia. Here's an example of one of our field sites. This is the Nagarjuna Institute for Buddhist Studies in Kathmandu. So probably the first project that we did after we became BDRC was the scanning of the fragile palm leaf manuscript collection in Thailand. So this is the personal library of Peter Skilling, scholars Peter Skilling, who I think of as the Gene Smith of Southeast Asia. At any rate, he has a massive library, and so we've decided to commit ourselves to digitizing the single largest body of text within his library, that being the Burmese, the text in Burmese script, which includes both text in the Burmese vernacular, but also Pali. So we've been working on that for several years. It's very time-consuming because although the entire collection has been cataloged, most of it has not been treated with any kind of conservation methods. So each and every folio of the palm leaf manuscripts needs to be washed, cleaned, re-inked and oiled before it's digitized. So we have a team that's twice as large as our usual teams because we need a conservation crew in addition to the photographers. The texts are being scanned to a very high, to archival quality, and these are going online as we speak. We also have a project in Cambodia that's been going on for about a year now, and it has two aspects. One is fieldwork based, and so we've been going into the countryside to collect manuscripts from village monasteries. We bring them to our site in the capital, scan them, and then we return the texts. In our budget, we have line items for gifts of fruit and whatnot to present to the monks when we request to borrow the texts. And then we also have money set aside in the budget for things like cabinets and bookshelves in case a particular monastery needs assistance in that way. But the texts are being scanned by a social enterprise called DDD, Digital Divide Data, and they do archival quality digitization, and we're very happy to work on this material because it actually pertains to the culture of the staff members themselves. Often they contract out work internationally. So this is so we're doing countryside scanning, and then also we are digitizing all of the microfilm that was made by the FEMC, the Cambodian outpost of the EFAO, and that microfilm is very valuable because many of the photos were taken 10, 15 years ago, and it's likely that a significant amount of the texts that they photographed are now completely lost, destroyed either because of fire, flooding, pests, or perhaps stolen or sold on the black market. So both the text in the countryside and the film are being digitized and will go online soon. The National Library of Mongolia. How much time do I have left? I've been paying attention. I'm all right? Okay. So this is the National Library of Mongolia. I already introduced it, but this is a project that we are working on with ACIP, Asian Classics Input Project. And when we began 2 years ago, probably half of the texts at the library were in the same condition that they were in when they were delivered to the library during the Soviet period. I mean, not only were they uncatalogued, but they were just in these, bundles. And so we have, gone through and separated all the texts, cataloged them, and are digitizing them, again, according to, the highest archival standards. So those are some of our newer projects that was happy to tell you about, and I look forward to hearing your questions about, maybe the content of some of these collections or who we've been working with and whatnot. But before I end, I would like to give a brief introduction to our next generation web platform. As I mentioned, that when we moved up from being a Tibetan-centric organization to one that tries to embrace all of the Buddhist literary heritage, we needed to make significant upgrades to our database. And the resulting software is called Buddha, the Buddhist Universal Digital Archive. And in fact, initially it was just called the BDA, the Buddhist Digital Archive. And it was Peter Skilling, who we work with in Thailand, who said, no, turn it into a Buddhist acronym. Why don't you add universal in there? It fits. And so we did. Buddha will launch in March of this year. The software itself is already done. Now we're applying the graphic design to the interface. So the funding came largely from the Ho Foundation, but we also collaborated with Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, China. So there's 3 components to Buddha, which we think of as a Buddhist library for the information age. Digitization work in the field without creating, new content. There's not much for us to work on. So we will never give up on digitization work in the field. But it also required us to devise a new ontology, an overall framework that can accommodate the different canonical and vernacular traditions. And then we needed a new image viewer, and I'll explain about that in a moment. But first, the unified Buddhist ontology. So over the last couple of years, we've developed a flexible ontology that facilitates open access and data sharing. And so in case you don't know what ontology means in this context, an ontology is essentially a shared vocabulary. It's a framework that can be used to name entities by a community of scholars so that different databases can communicate to one another. Like I said earlier, organically, it's very easy to understand interrelations between families of materials. But digitally, it's much more difficult. It has to be done in a very precise way. And the process for doing that is called the elaboration of an ontology. So we have been working on that. It's not my personal specialty, so I'm just going to show you some graphs that give you a sense for how things are put together. So, for instance, with this one, we take the Bodhicharyavatara as a kind of a model. So, on the one hand, to the left of the dotted line, you have the BDRC, internal kind of ontology for connecting the abstract notion of the text with its different instances, and then all the other related metadata we have, such as author and so forth. And then to the right of the dotted line, you have, in this case, I think it's the C beta entry for it. And so this is something we had to elaborate, and it's now working quite well, and I'll give you some further examples of the ontology in practice. The triple IF image viewer. I visited the British Library for the first time in May of 2018. Now, I had a planned vacation to London. It was just going to be a vacation for pleasure, months in advance. But then 2 days before I departed Berkeley for London, I received the phone call from Curtis Schaefer, at that time the president of the board of BDRC, offering me the job. Completely turned my life upside down. And I said, well, I'm going to London. Give me a few days to think about it. And then he said, oh, great. Well, while you're in London, why don't you meet Adam at EAP, and on and on and on. So it quickly turned into a business trip for which I was never reimbursed. Thank you very much. But at any rate, I had a couple of meetings with Jody and Adam, and I heard all about IIIF. It meant nothing to me at the time. In fact, I think Burkhart was also preaching the IIIF doctrine to me at the time. It almost, was so intimidating that I thought, I don't have the capacity to deal with this. This job is not for me. But at any rate, I stuck with it, and I'm so glad I did. IIIF, what does it stand for? III, International Image Interoperability Framework. What's so great about IIIF is that it's sort of the visual partner to the ontology. The ontology works at the database level to make connections between things. And the IIIF image viewer works at the practical level to unite disparate digital collections within the framework, or within the sort of window of one viewer on a single website, wherever that might be. And so here's just an example for those of you who do Buddhist Studies and are used to our not so user-friendly viewer from our last generation web platform. This is what our image viewer looks like now. But what to me is so important is that you can display resources from other collections on your own site. So that helps us make a lot of progress towards creating a universal digital archive. So in conjunction with the ontology, it's now possible to assemble and curate collections that are drawn from multiple libraries but are organized within a single system. So just to give you an example of how we bring collections from outside directly onto BDRC, here's an example of a text, the Manjushri Namasamgiti. And this work record here is BDRC's work record, but the images come from EAP, because they too, being a very forward-thinking, progressive organization, also utilize linked data and IIIF. So this is what it looks like. And here are some other collections that we have. Through our ontology and IIIF, we have been able to bring the entire Taisho canon, the canon of in Chinese script, directly into our website. We get our images from SAT, one of the two major digital collections of the Chinese language canon. And so this is an example of a text. So the images are coming from Japan. We import some of the metadata from Japan, but then we integrate it within our own framework. And so this is what's called an abstract record of the text. This is the highest level record that is just the very idea of the Vajracchedika. And so within it, it has expression. We've now changed that to say has canonical expression. What do we say now? Something like canonical language. So that would be Sanskrit, and then other canonical translations, Chinese, Tibetan, and so forth. We even, by bringing on Marcus Bingham-Heimer's data, are able to lead users to languages and rather translations in various European languages. But what to me is most exciting is not what IIIF can do for us, but what it allows BDRC and other organizations such as EAP to do for the broader Buddhist community. And so this is where I think technology is enabling Gene Smith's vision to really continue to develop and have even further and deeper impacts. So, as I mentioned, we're working in Cambodia and Mongolia and a few other countries. But particularly in Cambodia and Mongolia, we've negotiated with the ministries of culture and other cultural institutions like that. And they asked, how we could, prove to them that we weren't just going in a very extractive way, scanning texts and leaving them maybe with some catalog information, but nothing else. And so we assured them that we would create localized websites for them in either Mongolian or Khmer that served up seamlessly, all of the texts that we scanned in their countries. They were, certainly they were very open to this idea because through use of this technology, we're able to provide them with a complete archive of their own literary heritage, but without the expenses of them needing to purchase the equipment, maintain the equipment, and all the other upgrades that are required in perpetuity when you have a complicated digital archive. So just to give you a quick example of how this is done, we had to come up with a digital solution for this, and it's a little bit of software we created called the embedded reader. So what you see in the center here is a reader that allows for people to go into the BDRC archive, select only the text they want, arrange them in a hierarchy, and then by just inserting a little bit of code onto their website, this embedded reader pops up, and every time you click on a folder and select a text, it will show up seamlessly on one's own website for free with pretty good assurance that these texts will continue to be online for the next 20, 30 years. Let me give you an example of one implementation of this. This was a case study we did with Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche's monastery in India. So here you have basically the entire monastic curriculum for the Khyentse Buddhist Academy. So you go through the whole curriculum year by year, then you open up a particular class, you see all the texts, then you click on a particular textbook, you see a sample image, click on the image itself, and then the text appears in the website. So the monk who's at this monastery and using their own website with a local, I guess in India, .in suffix, never has to leave their website, has complete control over the context and the overall messaging, but gets the images for free. As much as they want, and of course, they can be deleted whenever. This is the website that we've begun working on for the National Library of Mongolia. It can be viewed entirely in Mongolian, fully localized. Here's a sample image of a text from the National Library of Mongolia. And that's how you view it, and all at minimal cost to them. So when I think about the present and the future of BDRC and how it relates to other efforts that we've been hearing about this weekend. I think that, what we all need to be working on is preservation, connection, and then amplifying and enabling. So it's been lovely to be here all weekend. I've met so many new friends, and I hope that we can continue to collaborate together to find digital solutions for conserving, preserving, and gaining new insights from the Buddhist literary heritage. So thank you very much.
You've been listening to a British Library podcast. For more information, visit www.bl.uk/podcast.